Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11.1 meta for each stage of the game. Soon we'll be saying goodbye to this current meta as 4.5 will be coming out and shaking everything up. But for now, let's focus on what the 11.1 meta looks like for anyone still looking to climb in the last few days before everything has changed. There's a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video, and to begin with, let's talk about the item meta for 11.1. Overall, we're still in a healthy meta for items as there's a wide variety of usable components that build into flexible items. There's almost always an item that you can make early in the game to increase your board strength. For now, let's talk about the priority of each component on the beginning carousel. While you'll be fine with any component, there is still a difference in value between the different components. In general, the items that will be most useful in the meta are going to be built from either the sword or the glove. Sword is used for several carry items like Deathblade and Giant Slayer, such champions like Ashe, Jhin, and Aphelios are commonly used in the meta. Zeke's Herald is always a fantastic choice and is usually the go-to item to slam early game if you have the components to make it. Lastly, you can look to make a Guardian Angel, which doesn't get as much value early game, but is always worth having later on. Glove has multiple uses ranging from defensive to offensive. One of the most popular and flexible items you can make from a glove in the early game is a Hand of Justice. It fits well into practically any composition, so making it early is fine to do. Other glove items include Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, Jeweled Gauntlet, and Quicksilver. As always, Quicksilver is a high tier item because it's essential to have on most carry champions. That said, it's not really an item that you want to make early game as the value it gives only begins mattering around the mid game. Jeweled Gauntlet has risen in popularity thanks to the return of Vanguard Mystic with Ahri carry, but it isn't too flexible of an item, so be careful making it too early in the game. And the last glove item to touch on that is quite important for the current meta is Last Whisper. Armor-heavy frontlines are more and more common, especially with Vanguard Mystic. Last Whisper on a Jhin or Ashe will help immensely in doing damage to high armor targets. But it's also not too flexible of an item, so don't worry about making it early. Next, there's Tear, Rod, and Bow. All three of these bring different value to the meta, with Tear usually being the most contested. Tear builds into one of the most powerful early game items, Chalice of Power, and is the second component used for Hand of Justice. Blue buff always has a lot of value since it can be used on a multitude of different champions. Rod can be a flexible component since it builds into early game focused items like Locket or Ludens. It's not as valuable to grab early on since it's generally not too contested compared to other high priority components. Bow is similar since the items Bow builds into are less flexible, and thus grabbing early bows isn't nearly as important. Bow mainly matters if you're aiming to play Zed Ninjas, as that composition requires several bows. And of course, Bow is useful for Giant Slayer and Last Whisper, which are meta items for range carries. That gives us the defensive components, Chain Vest, Belt, and Cloak. Chain Vest and Belt are fantastic for the early game because both of them can be used to build a Sunfire Cape. Sunfire is easily one of the best early game items, though it does lose a bit of value as the game goes on. Otherwise, you're going to see Chain Vest used for Locket, Guardian Angel, and in some cases, Titan's Resolve. Belt mainly serves as the secondary component for quite a few meta items, including the already mentioned Sunfire Cape and Zeke's. ZZ Rot Portal is also an okay item to make early on in the game, as the construct adds a lot of additional health to your board. And the last component is going to be Cloak. Cloak can be great for Chalice or Ionic Spark, but it's really not that necessary to prioritize over other components. The fact is, if you end up with multiple cloaks, it will make your items awkward later on, so generally it's best to avoid picking up Cloak off the beginning carousel. It's also one of the least contested components throughout the game, so finding it later shouldn't be too difficult. Alright, with items covered, we can now shift over to the different stages of the game, beginning with the early game. This will be from the beginning carousel through stage 2 and ends early on in stage 3, usually by 3-2 when most of the lobby levels to 6. Since we've already covered the beginning carousel, let's briefly talk about stage 1. This is all PvE, so the main focus here is what to use your gold on. Since they've changed the PvE drops to usually guaranteed 5 to 6 extra gold, you have a little bit of wiggle room in what you can buy from your shop. Generally, the goal here is to buy pairs and look for an okay chosen to use. Certain chosen champions will be weaker than others, but overall, if you decide to commit to buying a one-cost chosen, make sure you have other champions to pair with it so that you end with a strong and cohesive board. At the end of stage 1, you have an additional choice to make, which is whether or not to pre-level to 4. Pre-leveling prior to Stage 2 can often be worth the investment since your shop will potentially have 2-cost champions or even a 2-cost chosen if you don't already have a chosen. It's not essential to do this, but if you have gold left over at the end of 1-4, then pre-leveling is usually worth it for the potential payoff. With that, let's go ahead and move on into Stage 2. Stage 2 is all about trying to build your strongest board to preserve health. This is usually done by hitting 2-star champions, but also slamming early items like Sunfire, Zeke's, Chalice, or Locket. Stage 2 can also be the point of the game for certain compositions to begin forming. A chosen Yasuo, for example, is pivotal for duelists later on, so if you hit it early, you can look to focus on that comp for the mid game. A chosen Moonlight is also commonly found during Stage 2, same for chosen Zed. Basically, any of the builds that will re-roll later on will begin during Stage 2. Keep in mind that even if you're given one of these options, you don't necessarily have to force it. Simply buy and play those champions and see how the rest of Stage 2 goes, as you won't fully commit to them until Stage 3. Anyways, let's focus back on what standard Stage 2 looks like. As mentioned, slam items and build your strongest board by 2-starring champs. Leveling to 4 is also important if you haven't already leveled. Look to do this at either 2-1 or 2-2, though 2-1 gives you an extra round to potentially hit a 2-cost chosen. As for level 5, you can either pre-level prior to the end of 2-4 carousel, or level instead on round 2-5. The quick rule to follow here is that if you can't make 10 gold interest at the end of 2-3, then pre-leveling is better, otherwise just wait. From here, the rest of Stage 2 is simple, as you're just looking to upgrade your board. After Krugs, you'll be leveling to 6 around 3-2, which is where the early game ends. With the early game ending, we're now moving into the mid game. This begins early Stage 3 and ends around the latter half of Stage 5. The mid game is all about building your economy, rolling to stabilize when needed, and making your way to level 8. Right at the start of Stage 3, most players will be leveling to 6 on 3-2. Level 6 in most of Stage 3 can be skipped by most players, but there are some players that need to roll. Those players either have exceptionally weak boards or are so close to power spikes that rolling is worth it. When you roll at level 6, keep in mind the goal is to stabilize, so even if you roll a bit too much, as long as you end up with a stronger board than you had before, it's worth it. That said, try not to roll too much, as ideally you want to remain above 20 or even 30 gold and never roll lower than 10, as that will completely grief your economy. Upgrades to your board include selling your Stage 2 chosen for the chance to get a better one, and overall hitting upgrades to your existing champions. Rolling at 6 is also good for anyone close to a major power spike, like 6 warlords or cultists, something that will give your board a huge boost in strength. With the end of Stage 3, let's move into Stage 4, where most players will be looking to level on 4-1. It is definitely viable to level earlier than 4-1, but only do that if you've been on a win streak or have a ton of gold. Otherwise, the plan is to level on 4-1 to 7 and determine if you need to roll. Most of the time, you'll need to roll a little bit at level 7, unless you've been high rolling. Keep in mind if your board is doing well enough, as in winning around here or there, or at least not losing much health, you don't want to sell anything and simply roll a little bit for upgrades. Only sell parts of your board if it's clearly not working and costing you a lot of health. Stage 4 is when certain comps will begin forming. Dust Jhin, for example, can be picked up piece by piece during this stage, since it uses 4 Dust champions and Jhin is the core unit. Hunter is another option, since Kindred is a highly valued 3-cost unit, which we can use to transition into Ashe build later. Lastly, picking up an Ahri if available and Vanguard champions can help move you into a Vanguard Mystic comp later. The overall goal for level 7 and Stage 4 is to make your way to level 8 as quickly as you can while minimizing the amount of health that you lose. Look to level to 8 somewhere between 4-5 and 5-1. When you level, make sure you have around 30 gold left over. That way, if you need to roll immediately, you at least have enough gold to make substantial upgrades to your board. And with that, we move into Stage 5. Stage 5 is where your board will begin to solidify itself into whatever composition you found yourself with. This can be, as mentioned, Dust Jhin, Ashe Hunter, Vanguard Mystic, and several other viable options. The best piece of advice to keep in mind when rolling and looking to form your composition is to be flexible. Play what the game gives you. This means if you find yourself with a less than ideal chosen, like say a chosen cultist Jhin, you should still use it. Being greedy and bypassing what you're rolling to try and hit the perfect composition is almost always a mistake. Let's go ahead and move into the late game. The late game begins around the end of Stage 5 and continues until, well, the end of the game. There are a few key things to talk about for the late game. The first is 5-cost champions. 5-cost champions are the lifeblood of the late game. Champions like Yone, Kayn, Zillion, and Azir are super strong and always worth considering as additions into your comp. The second thing to keep in mind in the late game is level 9. Level 9 is difficult to obtain, which should still be the goal unless you're too low on health to invest the time and gold into it. But if you can, try and hit level 9 sometime during stage 6. There's a multitude of options once you hit level 9, but the most important is being able to hit 2-star 5 costs consistently. And if you're unable to level to 9, then make sure you spend your gold rolling for upgrades. Never end the game with excess gold that you could have spent, as even 10 gold can make the difference between a 3rd and 2nd place finish. And the last thing to keep in mind is scouting and positioning. Make sure you're always scouting diligently to check what other players are playing, what upgrades they've hit recently, and what threats they have to your board. From there, you can maneuver your champions as needed. Exactly how you position varies from board to board and game to game, but a good idea to consider is always shifting your units around to force others to keep having to scout you. Overall, the late game is important, but having a strong early and mid game will have more of an impact on the game than anything. Look to improve those stages of the game, and you should find yourself placing in the top 4 more consistently. That's all for today's video, folks. This is the last meta for the original Set 4, and thankfully, we've ended on a great one. The Balance team has done a great job in getting the meta into a healthy and diverse place. But Set 4.5 is right around the corner, and that's definitely going to create chaos for the meta. Let us know in the comment section below what you're going to miss most from Set 4 and what you're looking forward to in Set 4.5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.